Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining. We've got about a minute to go. Really want to take some time and just say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this large discussion. There are only so many human beings that wake up on a Tuesday morning excited to talk about e-learning interoperability standards, and I was shocked to see how many of you guys decided to join this. So certainly grateful for the time, and I think Brian and I have some interesting insights here to share this morning as we get started.
Yeah.
We will have a little bit of audience participation today. There'll be a couple polls. We'll ask some questions. You certainly have the ability in the comments section to ask questions of our team. Tara and Alicia and Josh are all behind the scenes helping us gather those. And if we have time at the end, we'll certainly address them. And if we don't, then certainly that might be a good opportunity for us to have a one-on-one conversation. These are always discussions, and our attitude is ask us anything really. So be sure to use the questions box as needed. Um, it is the top of the hour, so I guess it's time to go. Good morning. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Tompkins. This is Brian Miller. We're from Rusticy Software. We have the pleasure of working with a lot of different e-learning standards groups, including the fabulous folks at the IEEE, as well as ADL and One Ed Tech. We are participants in these as much as a lot of you who are on the calls are, and I just can't say enough kind words about the work that those organizations do. And certainly with the IEEE, if you guys want to be involved, if there's anything that you want to do to participate in those things, please let Brian and I know. This is a community, certainly, that helps these e-learning tools play nicely with one another. And if you have strong feelings about where the direction of these things should go, please, please, please get involved. I can't speak highly enough about the IEEE and the work that they're doing. So Brian and I are certainly just participants in a lot of these larger discussions, but I think it is a cool moment for us to check in today and see some of the changes that we've seen in the last 25 years, the last year, and where we think things might go in the next five. Before we get too deep into the standards, for those of you who don't know us, it might be worthwhile talking a little bit about who is Rusticy Software. We're about 50 people, mostly in Nashville, and we care very much about helping e-learning products play nicely with one another. We know a ton about the various standards that the ADL, the IEEE, and One Ed Tech are supporting. We love them all equally. They are different tools in the toolbox that are helping us connect different products together to make sure that learning, training, events, and data are moving between these platforms elegantly. We're good at this one thing and almost nothing else. We don't make authoring products, we don't make learning management systems, but we make the stuff that helps all of these things play nicely together. So I've been at Rusticy around 13 years. I was one of the first business people they let in the building. I really enjoy this. I'm passionate about this part of the industry. I've watched in my time here the learning and training development place grow, evolve, and do exciting things. I play with AR, VR, XR in my personal life. I understand what it's like to be in those environments and the type of data available and what's training, and I'm very excited about what's coming next and some of the things that xAPI, CMI5, and these new standards are able to do inside of those digital environments. Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Brian Miller. I lead our engineering product teams here at Rusticy Software. I really came in a little bit after Chris, been here about 11 years, a little over 11 years, and my work prior to Rusticy involved a lot of open source software. I've kind of been in the open source software movement, since the 90s. Uh, and so it's one of the things that really attracted me to working on the e-learning standards. One of the first things I did at Rusticy was to work on what was then called Tin Can and write a bunch of open source libraries. Those things are still out there in existence. We use them in our software. A lot of other people have them, under the hood in their software, kind of like Chris was saying. And so, this effort is just a continuation of that. Like, how do we push these standards, in an open way for people to leverage these in tools in their ecosystem, what have you, and it's progressed a ton. The open source community has progressed a ton in 25 years. The e-learning standards has progressed a ton in that same time frame, especially in the last 10 years. The work that IEEE has done with the bringing in what are previously open source specifications and allowing those to be standardized under open source licenses is really a cool thing. So love to see that continue.
Excellent. So, as we talk about that, Brian and I have obviously been doing this day in and day out for a long time, and so is Rusty Software. When you look at the 50 folks that are focused on this every day here at our organization, we have 25 years of solving the challenge of helping two e-learning products get along. Whether that's launching or tracking or bookmarking or reporting, there are a lot of things that have to go right when organizations of scale are trying to play nicely within their ecosystem. Our story really begins in 1998, of all places. The AICC standard is amazing. It's still used widely today. The aviation industry was an early adopter of this type of remote learning, and the AICC standard is still used today, even though it was the first real iteration. I'm big admirer of ADL, and they spent roughly 10 years working and perfecting the SCORM standard itself, the specification rather. SCORM 1.2 is certainly one of the widest used standards in the world today, but SCORM 2004 was a continuum as it went through really three different editions, second, third, and fourth. And there are challenges certainly to using SCORM as a broad term, but when we look at each one of those editions, they all have a fit for purpose, whether we're doing individual questions and answers or non-linear paths through learning. That development over that time was important. And it is a big chunk of time. And you'll notice Brian and I kind of showed up right around the time things were shifting more over to what we're considering more modern standards like xAPI, CMI5. And that amount of time is roughly 10-year chunk. So I hear a lot of folks, especially at the speed of business that most of us operate at private companies, and we look at this timeline and we say, "My goodness, standards are lagging. These things aren't being adopted," but they actually are. And I think in a lot of ways, xAPI is on a faster path, and with the IEEE moving xAPI from a specification to an international standard, we actually have a better foundation with xAPI than we've had with SCORM, which has been widely successful throughout the world. So while these things might not be in flight in the way that some of us who are pushing on these things and building new tools and trying to go fast are trying to get to, I will say that it is encouraging that these things should take time. When it comes to interoperability, it is about the only time in technology where something's age is actually its strength. The way it's been adopted, the same way across all these businesses, across all these tools, across all these organizations, matters. And that strong foundation, the thought process of getting it right, taking your time, and building a consortium over that amount of effort and across those many people is important. And I think it is necessary to look at the timeline, take a deep breath, realize that, look, Brian and I have been doing this for a long time, and so has Rusty, and there are folks on this call that are far more tenured than we are in this discussion. But I am very encouraged about xAPI's future because it has a similar foundation to something that we understand and knows that works. It was developed faster by more people in a better way. And now with the IEEE's blessing of xAPI 2.0 as a international standard, it gives a lot of wind to the sails to take us into the adoption phase, which is really where we've been for a little while, but certainly what's going to come next. So I think this is on pace, and I'm actually encouraged and not discouraged by this timeline. And I think a lot of us, Brian and I, certainly a lot of folks at Rusty, but a lot of people on this call are dedicating their careers to solving these problems. We care, we're passionate about these things, and I'm grateful there are groups like ADL, IEEE, and What Ed Tech moving us through this timeline today. Um, so I think it's time for a poll, and allow me to go ahead and put that up in front of us. We are going to have some curiosity amongst all the folks on here. So if you can just take a time and click, this is a multiple select, I think. Which standards at your organization are you using today? We're really curious about if this is going to line up with the folks on the call with some of the data that we see in our SCORM cloud, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So answers are moving in. When these wiggles stop moving around, I will close the poll. Just a quick look, but so far, the live data says SCORM 1.2 is roughly 3 out of 4. We're looking at xAPI is about half, probably is exciting. CMI5 is on the list. All right, things have stopped moving. I'm going to end our poll and we're going to share the results. So I think I've posted those. Roughly 75% of you all use SCORM 1.2 today. A little less than half use SCORM 2004. xAPI is at 43%, which I think is really, really interesting there. As we go back to our presentation here, Brian, can you see the right screen? I guess Alicia will let me know those things. Let me know if I'm doing it wrong. So when we look at SCORM Cloud, I think this is a good representative snapshot. It's not scientific. This isn't the perfect statistical data, but SCORM Cloud has been running roughly 15 years. It's seen millions and millions of course uploads. It has hundreds of thousands of active users. It launches tens of millions of courses. It is a big platform and gives us somewhat of an insight. For those of you who have never used it, it is a free place to test your course. Things that play and track in SCORM Cloud should play and track the same way everywhere else. If it doesn't, ask us anything really. There's a guy here named Joe Donnelly that would love to talk to you about why this might be not working or behaving as expected. It sees a lot of activity. It supports a wide variety of standards, including SCORM, AICC, 10CAN, CMI5. There's a lot of things that it can do. It's not an LMS. It's not a good look at the learning management system market. It's intentionally a light way to deliver a course to a learner and track their progress through it. But I think for the purposes of today's discussion, SCORM Cloud's insights show us some really important and interesting trends. So when we look at by year the type of courses that are being uploaded, we're looking at a lot of content being piled into SCORM Cloud for the first time every year. And taking some of the noise out, and we just look at standards, in 2023, over half of all of the content uploaded to SCORM Cloud on any given day was a SCORM 1.2 package. And the next one is AICC, which is really encompassing the two oldest standards on the timeline that we showed long ago. Again, when it comes to interoperability, it is the only time in tech where something's age is its strength, and we can see that strength represented pretty well here. Regardless of the details of the last 3 years, over 75% of all new packages uploaded to SCORM Cloud are either SCORM 1.2 or AICC. Very fascinating. But I'm really encouraged by the right side of this chart. If we look at the rise of 10CAN and CMI5, we can start to see that they are actually the fastest growing standards that we are starting to see in SCORM Cloud, which means these messages are working. Adoption is increasing. People are moving these charts in piles of millions of courses. And so as these things change, I start to point at it and go, look, this isn't an overnight thing. It takes a long time for standards to evolve and for adoption to move forward, but we are seeing it. The cold water is certainly that AICC and SCORM 1.2 are still the most common things used in the industry, and I'm candidly not surprised by that. They work well, they launch a thing, it bookmarks and tracks and does the things people want, and for most e-learning experiences, that's fine. But when you look at the right side, especially with CMI5, we're really starting to see some growth there. And I expect that that teal box will start to creep deeper and deeper into this as the tool is more widely adopted, more tools out in the marketplace support it with full force. And we're starting to see the rise of the things like the DoD and RFPs, the Department of Defense Instruction 132226 for all of my federal and Department of Defense based clients that are on this call. It is part of the mandate that's going forward. So as we're starting to see not only the implementation of these standards increase, but also the RFP requirements that you are using them increase, we are starting to see adoption in a very long running and established standards market. The other thing that I think is interesting to look at is not just which courses have been uploaded to SCORM Cloud, but also which courses are being played for human beings in SCORM Cloud. And it tells a little bit different story. AICC almost immediately goes away. SCORM Cloud is not a good representation of all of the courses being played for human beings everywhere in the world. I'm highly confident that people are testing AICC content in SCORM Cloud and then taking it to systems and servers and secret squirrel places, and that's great. So we're looking at two different problems here. But when we look at registration data, this is the number of courses delivered to real humans, and it is overwhelmingly still SCORM. Nearly 3 out of 4 course launches are still some flavor of SCORM 1.2 or SCORM 2004. But again, just like the last slide, I look at the right side and I go, wow, look at the growth and the rise of xAPI 10CAN CMI5 in this picture. I think that it's starting to show the industry that even amongst an increasing pile of course uploads and in an increasing pile of course launches, we are starting to see modern standards move into this pile. And I think when they start to take off, they will take off rapidly. But if anyone says SCORM is dead, I think these two slides start to really highlight SCORM is still very much in flight. SCORM and AICC are used all over, but we are starting to see a real rise, a real movement in standards that in the past previous years just have been a small blip on this radar. So, Brian, walk us through a little bit about the last year serving on the standards bodies. You're very close with ADL and IEEE and One Ed Tech. Walk us through a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, so this slide is it's one of my favorite. We have a wonderful crew that builds our slide decks for us because I can tell you that neither Chris nor I are this creative. So yes, it's funny. I talked about CMI5 for 90 minutes one year, and then they asked me to do it again. I couldn't believe it. And believe it or not, yes, I can talk about CMI5 for 90 minutes, but that isn't exactly what we're here for today. And yeah, this lovely picture of Chris. We attend a conference called ITSEC, and I think Chris uses all of the VR AR setups there. I think he even may have driven a snowplow this past year, if you can believe it. So, but moving forward, more interesting in the e-learning space is that xAPI became, xAPI 2.0 becomes an IEEE standard. This was the big marker for the last year that we kind of were all waiting for. This was a long road, as we've kind of described, but even beyond having xAPI in a workable state, in being used in the wild, being used by the industry, and really gaining an adoption, everyone took a pause and said, okay, but how do we take this to the next level? The next level is taking what we refer to as a specification and turning it into a standard. And with that comes a lot of very minutia work. It takes a lot of kind of grunt work. It is a fine-tooth comb over something that has already been combed kind of to death, and taking it even further. And then there is a whole process of voting and making sure that this is a standard that can live for multiple decades, not just for the next couple of years when it gets replaced by something else. So that process kind of, I don't want to say ended, but really came to a conclusion with xAPI 2.0 being voted on, being approved, and published as an IEEE standard. It was the first open source specification to really go through this process. I kind of alluded to that earlier. It's really a cool thing to see something built by a community of people, built by a community of contributors, and willing to put in their time and willing to, put out there their intellectual property, for lack of a better term, and say, yes, the world can use this, and if everyone uses it, then we're all better off for it. And IEEE kind of doing a little bit of a pivot because it's an older organization and they're saying, no, this is a thing that we need to adopt. This is a process that works well. So, xAPI really was, the guinea pig here, and we're seeing it even with CMI5 development. Some of the rails that were greased by xAPI going through this process has improved IEEE's methods, and it's really made the next one of these to come along going to be that much easier. It's funny, we talk about standardizations and these types of things. So if you go out there and you look, it's actually the IEEE standard for learning technology. JavaScript object notation, data model format, and representational state transfer web service for learner experience data tracking and access, which is why we just call it xAPI.
Rolls right off the tongue.
That's right. That's right. Or if you prefer, 9274.1.1, again, we just call it xAPI or xAPI 2.0. And we put in a thing here that xAPI is now recognized on the same level as the Wi-Fi standard, and we really mean it on a standards basis, right? Obviously, everyone has heard of Wi-Fi. I don't think yet everyone has heard of xAPI, but it's on that same footing. It's on the same footing that that when you connect to an LRS that is conformant with the standard, that it's going to work in the same way that any other LRS conformant to the standard will work. And that's really what being a standard is all about.
Yep.
So moving on from xAPI 2.0 becoming a standard, one of the things that I mentioned was that I worked on a whole bunch of open source libraries, and they really enabled vendors to implement xAPI, especially in the content side. And that work kind of sat still. There was, it was effective because it kind of just worked, because it was working against something that would become a standard. So we knew that it would continue to work. And once it kind of hit a certain level of fidelity, it doesn't need a ton of change. But what we didn't do and what we didn't continue to do is produce these for newer environments that started showing up. And so one of the really exciting things, and I've talked to these guys directly this past year, and they presented for us at our user conference, a company called Cassette released an xAPI plugin that allows you to essentially capture and use xAPI requests from an Unreal Engine application or game, simulator, those types of environments. And it's really a neat thing to see someone else taking up this mantle of, again, they produced a library. They could have kept it closed. They could have kept it just to themselves. But they said, no, if we're going to use xAPI, we need more people in this industry, more people using Unreal Engine to adopt and to start capturing data in the same way that they are. And so it's really exciting to see, someone else who isn't necessarily even one of the major standards contributors taking up and producing something and letting the world use it. So if you're into the Unreal Engine space, or even if you're into the Unity space, if you're doing 3D modeling or you're doing, those kinds of environments, take a look at what they've done and see if you can leverage what they've done and or contribute back to what they've produced. And then one other thing, we always visit a certain number of conferences each year. The DevLearn is one of our biggest, certainly. Like I said, we tend to go to ITSEC, but another thing that happened this year was the 2023 IEEE Icicle Conference. So Icicle is essentially, this group that is trying to evolve the way that we think about learning and add an engineering-like component to it. So it is a way to leverage data as part of your process to improve learning outcomes. So for those of you that aren't as familiar, there's this whole spectrum around, how do we improve the feedback loop? And it's really to define the feedback loop for, engineering of learning material. So, it is create a learning piece, capture data, look at the data, and then improve that learning piece or that learning experience based on the data that you're capturing. And coincided with something called ADL's Plugfest that took a couple of years off, but is now back. It's a way for vendors to kind of show off what they're doing. And it was a nice way to dovetail this notion of data and the way that data is changing, learning ecosystems, along with capturing of that data to improve then learning engineering processes. So I think this is a whole area that's going to continue to grow. It's growing as a profession, as an academic discipline, et cetera. There's another conference already planned for this year. Somewhat ironically, it will be the Icicle Conference happening in midsummer in Phoenix. So there was quite a few number of jokes at the last conference about the location and timing of that. So we'll try not to melt is the bottom line there, I think.
All right. So I think it's time for another poll. We plugged in to generative AI, hey, what are Brian and I going to look like in 5 years? And it basically said we might get a tan, which I think is kind of flattering. I think Brian's timeless, so that's always nice. Um, but as you guys look into the next 5 years, I'm going to launch a poll here. What do you think's going to happen to your learning organization? Which standards do you think your product mix will use most? It's often interesting to me that when we go and talk to large vendors, even medium-sized companies, they often have 20 to 30 pieces of learning technology moving in their ecosystem at any one time. And that's the moment where these standards matter most. If you're going to have all of these different tools available to you, knowing which standard will tie them together and allow something published here to launch here, to let the data go here, becomes a real challenge. And it's one that all of these standards are aiming to solve. So as we look through our poll here, we've got about half of you reporting results. Thank you for participating here. Sticking to SCORM, roughly a third. xAPI, give me the data, is nearly half. CMI5 is 38%. xAPI to use with newer technologies is the highest rated one here at over 55%. And CMI5 is another third. So really exciting. I think this room is ready for what's next. We've done a lot with SCORM. I'm not going to beat up on SCORM, but I am excited that more people are involved and more people are trying to do the next thing and have that desire, knowing that in their learning ecosystem, they're doing things that are next gen that aren't the right fit for purpose for these standards. That said, SCORM's not dead. I hear it all the time. Oh, this is the thing that's going to kill SCORM. I hope CMI5 does, to be really direct. Brian and I are working very hard. But the reality is, when we look at the massive pile of courses that we're helping support day in and day out, when we answer questions for folks that are instructional designers, learning management system administrators, chief learning officers at these organizations, SCORM is still king. SCORM 1.2 is mostly of what's being delivered. As you saw on the table, AICC is still very much in flight, even though these are two of the oldest standards in the mix. But I will make some predictions over the next 5 years. I think SCORM continues to be the leader for things that have a beginning, a middle, and end in an assessment. When you're trying to launch a course and you just need to know what Brian and I call the big four: time, completion, pass, fail, score, maybe some bookmarking. If you're doing the basics, SCORM works pretty well. And in fact, SCORM is showing its strength because even as we move to a primarily mobile environment for learning, SCORM is still able to do everything that we need it to do. SCORM isn't standing in the way of a lot of these technologies. We even see people using it for launching and tracking the basics of a VR expression within an LMS. SCORM has the ability to adapt to modern environments, and it is. We even got it approved by Joe. For those of you who haven't met Joe, I would be shocked. Most 100 people on here probably asked us for support at some time, and if you haven't, please do. But Joe is one of the guys that knows all the ins and outs of the SCORM standard itself. And if you ask us anything really by emailing support@rusticysoftware.com, you're probably going to meet one of the Donnelly brothers, Joe probably, to answer your questions about SCORM. And yeah, he blessed it. Hey, look, it's doing the job that it needs to do. Take a thing, launch a thing, track a thing. Great. But I do think CMI5 should be the standard that does give SCORM a little less market share in those charts. xAPI is a communications channel. It's a way to help learning statements move from one place to another. It was never really designed to kill the packaged learning experience that gets loaded up into a learning system and played and tracked for a learner, but CMI5 should. So I think one day we will see CMI5 climb in and displace SCORM and AICC, which will be exciting, but maybe not in the next 5 years. It'll take time. There will not be a new version of SCORM in the next 5 years. I won't say ever because I don't know, maybe in the future that has a revival, but certainly CMI5 is the path. All of these standards bodies are working towards CMI5 as the long-term play. And I think in the next 5 years, we won't see SCORM evolve, but we will start to see it get replaced by CMI5. I've said CMI5 a lot on this slide. Brian, why don't you go into a little more of the technical details of why I'm so excited?
Sure. So, I mean, CMI5 is working down this standards path. That's one of the biggest issues with the early adoption of xAPI through something we called Tin Can. It was essentially a set of launch guidelines, and that was it. It was a document put together by one of our fabulous standards experts, Ben Clark, happened to write the first specification for xAPI. I worked on SCORM. He said, "Hey, this is a way that you might use this," and all of a sudden, uh, the machine went out and rolled out all of these packages that were using this, and it was never on a standards path. It was never expected to live as long as it did. So uh, we're working on CMI 5.2.0. The intention is to get to CMI 5.2.0 so that it is using the new standard. It is using xAPI 2.0. CMI 5 itself is part of what are called the ADL fungible resources for the Department of Defense instruction that Chris already mentioned. And what we're seeing from ADL and the DoD is that they are essentially moving CMI 5 closer to the top of the guidance. So, for a very long time, it was you must use SCORM. And then it was like you must use SCORM or you could use xAPI. And we're kind of seeing that flipped around on its head a little bit. Now it's, we're suggesting you use xAPI. We're preferring you use CMI5 to do that. If you have to fall back to SCORM, then you can do that. That's kind of the process. It's over time, essentially SCORM is moving down that list. And I hope someday that it falls off of that list. I don't know that it will, but it certainly can, as the Department of Defense gets more of its content replaced, more of its systems replaced, then maybe the instruction does become just CMI5 or, whatever comes after that. But essentially, the key is that CMI5 is moving up that list. It's moving up the list of what your go-to system should be or your go-to standard should be. So, having said that, CMI5 is essentially a work in process to get to a standardization point, to get to a 2.0, quote unquote 2.0 release. Some predictions. I think maybe we get to our first vote on CMI5 in the IEEE standards body, essentially next calendar year. I don't think we see that this calendar year. Some of my cohorts on the weekly calls would probably be sad to hear me say that. I can tell you that I have a meeting later today to continue working on this process. I will be meeting with IEEE's Open Standards program manager to talk about how we, what are the next steps? What is the next thing we need to do to get this moved to be a standard? But it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work to do that. So having said that, based on the time frames that Chris has gone through, I don't think that's pessimistic. I think it's actually very optimistic to say we could get to a vote next year. The working group has already laid out a number of changes that we want to make, a number of things that we've noticed over the last 7 years of being in a 1.0 status that we want to see improved. So it's really going to take some work there. But I think we can get to a really nice spot where we can see the longevity of CMI5 like we've seen the longevity of SCORM. I think there'll be another update to the DoD or TLA once CMI5 becomes an IEEE standard. It will nudge it up closer to the top of, yes, you should be doing this. It will assist in the other pieces of the TLA. And I think it's a fair prediction to make that we'll see increased adoption of CMI5. I would not go so far. I'm not bold enough to put a number on that. I don't know that we're going to see, again, SCORM 1.2 halved or something like that. But we will continue to see kind of this march forward of CMI5 adoption, more people capturing xAPI. And I think the point that Chris was saying earlier is maybe we see an acceleration of that. And so it's not just an increase of adoption, but it's an increase of acceleration of adoption. And that would be the really exciting thing.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I think it's an exciting time. We're here and we're saying, hey, adoption's not widespread. It's not worldwide, but I'm still enthusiastic and I'm very uh, bullish on the fact that this is the path, this is the way. We are going to get where we need it to be. It just takes time, and standards should. If standards change every night, not every vendor in the world can put all of the effort into updating these things as rapidly as I know a lot of businesses would prefer it to be. It's why this is the only time in tech where something's age is its strength. So I believe in the process. I believe it should be slow and methodical, but we are going to see an increase in demand in the next 5 years for data and tracking. And this increase in demand has to happen in RFPs, in quotes, in the things that people on this call are trying to do. A lot of times it's a chicken and egg situation. Brian and I talk to vendors of different products all day, every day, whether they're instructional designers or building authoring products or trying to make a learning management system or a learning experience platform or a learning analytics platform. There are a lot of people out there that care about standards in different ways. And if their customers aren't ever asking them for CMI5, they don't implement CMI5. The moment that this increase in demand will start to cause adoption to happen is when this room is asking the people who are building the tools that they want to use, which plan? Do you use xAPI 2.0? Are you working on CMI5 at all? If it's the first time they've ever heard of it, share your enthusiasm, your excitement with them. If it's the first time that they're ever hearing it, it might be foreign to them, but if every customer they ever talk to says, hey, we need you to use CMI5, they will go implement it much faster. So some of this is evangelism, and it's not just Brian and I talking about these weird standards for, 10, 20 years. It's this room saying, hey, there are sharper tools in the toolbox that we need to use, and we need your tool to sharpen itself. So the IEEE standard moving in xAPI 2.0 into a full-blown standardization worldwide helps with that. It helps vendors have the confidence that I'm not going to go do all of this work and implement this thing that no one's going to use. This is going to be the path, and it is well vetted and has a very solid foundation. That will help increase the adopters for both xAPI and CMI5 when this work is blessed and it's finalized and isn't going to change on them overnight. I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot more questions around learning record stores. A core part of the xAPI standard is having that special database where xAPI statements must live, known as a learning record store or an LRS. And when do you need one and which one should you get? There are many to choose from in the marketplace. It's a viable option with many millions of xAPI statements flying around the world in real time every day. This is a real path with real implementations and a real product matrix to go choose from. Do you need a chatty statement forwarding LRS? Do you need a way to provision activity providers? Or are you looking for more of a turnkey business analytics platform like a learning record store that has a learning analytics platform built in? There are a lot of choices to make, and there are right and wrong times to use one over another. And I think that that discussion is going to continue over the next 5 years. I think we're also at the edge of a larger conversation with these standards. In the next 5 years, we are going to have, as a standards community within xAPI, a real discussion around how to properly adopt xAPI profiles. CMI5 is the first real xAPI profile for launching a thing. We're going to need exemplar examples of profiles working for specific industries. We're going to need thought communities around how to build them, how to maintain them, how to steward them, how to grow them. Vendors can't always be looking at xAPI as a custom built data layer with a translation. Once these xAPI profiles are starting to make their way into more commonplace, more traditional e-learning things, I think we'll see adoption increase rapidly. So in the next 5 years, we're going to have real conversations around the adoption of xAPI profiles within industries, within niches, within products. And I think that I'm excited to have those conversations. I'm having them all day or as we speak. But the standards groups, I think, are also going to start picking that up. And there's great work going on right now within ADL and the IEEE to do some of this work. So I'm also encouraged that this isn't a hopeful goal. Man, I hope people adopt profiles. We're absolutely going to go do that work. And that's going to be the next real step over, the next 5-year timeline. Brian, talk us a little bit about Rusticy's adoption timeline for these new things.
Yeah, sure. So, we kind of have it, our core offering is our Rusticy engine product. We're expecting a release, major release in essentially I would call it middle of February, that will support xAPI 2.0. Now, we will not be the first product. We will not be the first LRS. We'll fully admit that to have 2.0 support, but we expect it to be still one of the best. Our LRS will accept 2.0 statements. The what I would call beta status of it, it's nearly released, is passing ADL's updated conformance test suite. It does support both the 1.0x specification and the 2.0 standard. We've even contributed back a number of, I'll call them fixes to the test suite. Turns out writing a standard is very hard. Turns out testing a standard is probably even harder. And so, they did a great work on that, but we found a few things that, will hopefully make that test suite better, and more vendors will adopt it using it as well. Put a bullet point in here that says engine will no longer support tin can statements. And I added a little asterisk here because I don't want to freak anybody out. If you have tin can packages right now, they will still play in SCORM Cloud. They will still play in Rusticy engine. What we've done is we put a stake in the ground and said, we're not going to continue to support this tin can set of guidelines going forward because it's just not a good security path. It's not on a standards path. It hasn't been community vetted. There's any number of issues with something that hasn't been worked on in 13 years. And so what we're saying is engine will no longer support tin can packages for capturing anything other than what it captures today. And you can't use 0.9 Project Tin Can API to get information back out of the LRS. You have to use an xAPI 1.0 or 2.0 request to get that data back out. Now, the packages will still work. The other thing that we've done here is basically said, no, you can't adopt xAPI 2.0 from Tin Can. So if you're launching a Tin Can package right now, you're getting a credential. That credential will not be allowed to talk xAPI 2.0 to our product. We're essentially trying to drive adoption towards CMI 5 with this. It's much better. It's on a standard path. The security around how you authorize yourself to talk to the LRS is improved. And so even though CMI 5 itself is not yet ready to support xAPI 2.0, you're at least putting yourself on a path so that you're going to be adopting something that will be standardized, will show up in our product as a standard as well, and will continue into the future. So that's essentially where we are. We're saying, we believe in xAPI, we believe in CMI 5. CMI 5 1.0 is perfectly reasonable. Go ahead and start using that. We'll be adopting CMI 5 2.0 as soon as we can. If you're not doing launched package content and you need an LRS that supports xAPI 2.0, then engine can support your use case, just not yet in the launch way. And again, as we see CMI 5 moving towards a standards path, engine will be there to support that use case.
Awesome. So what can you do now? You've sat through a long conversation around these standards, and maybe we've excited you and you go, great, okay, what's my next step? In the questions, I'm looking at Waleed, I'm looking at Brennan, Brett. You guys are all centered around this same conversation. And there are some very real and tangible next steps for folks on this. Number one, the xAPI cohort. Can't say enough great things. It is a semester-long program with your peers, and you will learn how to get your hands dirty. You will go through writing your own statements, how to use an LRS, how to build the things. Tara has shared a link in the chat so that you can click and follow up even more. that program is creating an army of xAPI practitioners. They've had many semesters. There's hundreds of people who are now initiated into xAPI, and I talk to them all day. I see the cool things that they're building. I'm very encouraged by what the cohort is able to do and fully support them. Big thank you for the efforts that they're putting into helping people actually learn how to use these standards themselves. Um, you can also look at resources like ADL's Project Catapult, an amazing way to help people get started right away with CMI5. There are examples, there's prototypes, there's testing suites, there's everything you need to make sure you're doing it and you're doing it in the proper way available through ADL for CMI5. And it is a fantastic place to go. Brian worked very hard on a lot of those assets, and we are super grateful for the ADL to continue to push that in a neutral way and guide those things. So Product Catapult is there to help you get started and to use those things regularly. There are also, the IEEE group, if you are in this vein and you care about the direction of these things, they would love to have people become more involved. It is a discussion, this is a community, and that means that we all have to participate in order to make it better. But so it depends on where on the scale you need to be. If you're trying to implement things, Catapult and the xAPI cohort are great places to start. xapi.com is a Rusty site that has a lot of resources there to help you get started and real tangible examples and prototypes to help you get going. So a lot of places out there. If you're not technical and you want to use off-the-shelf products, you need to start your search with vendors that are supporting these things today, and there are some out there. Rusty doesn't maintain an exhaustive list of everybody doing these things, but there is an xAPI adopters list at xapi.com. The ADL also has a fantastic and probably more thorough list than we do of people who are adopters of these things. And if you're looking for a short list of products that at least know what these things are, and you want to go talk to those vendors about what you're trying to achieve and if their tool is the right one to put in your hands, those two lists are amazing places to begin your hunt for products that do the things that you might have in your imagination. I would also highly encourage you, if you're trying to get started right now, SCORM Cloud offers a free LRS. There's no cost or obligation. It can manage activity providers, it can manage endpoints, and you can even use statement forwarding to pack up your xAPI statements and send them to another LRS later. It is a easy way to get started writing things on your own. xapi.com has a bunch of libraries and prototypes, and that's both sides of the coin if you're a little more technical and want to start building out your own ecosystem. If you're more of the type that, hey, I just need a learning analytics platform, I just want to look at some things, Watershed LRS has an essentials platform. It's an amazing place for you to get started right away, take what xAPI data you might have. There's also a number of works with Watershed implementations already done, and the Watershed Essentials platform is a learning analytics platform that you can put into your hands right away and start to play with xAPI today. So I don't feel like we're at a place in this adoption story where there aren't next steps. It depends on how technical you are and how involved you want to be, either with the standard itself or with using turnkey tools that are prepared for the type of training that you want to do. And this is a position that didn't exist 5 years ago. So big props to not only the organizations like ADL and IEEE that are driving it forward, but also to the xAPI cohort for teaching people how to do this, and to the many vendors that have already taken the leap and chose to implement these things on their own. It's a great community right now, and I'm very excited about the next steps. And I think there are things you can do today to start to build your path towards using these standards in the real world. I think that it's also important in this moment to think about your future training goals. If you want xAPI data and you want to use an LMS, then CMI5 is probably our bridge towards that gap. There are tools out there that can do some things with SCORM data and turning it into xAPI, and that's an implementation detail that each vendor is taking on their own. But you need to consider your plan. These are largely rhetorical questions to help you think about it in the right way. Do you want more data? I've seen xAPI implementations that drown their team in data. More isn't necessarily better. That's where a profile comes in. You get intelligent data. Do you just need an LMS? I mean, learning management systems aren't going to go away. They log learners in, they manage their cohort, they tell them what to do, they show their manager what they did. Like an LMS has its place in this arena probably indefinitely. But if you're trying to do more with your learning management system, you need to go have that conversation with your vendors. What are you trying to do that their platform can't do today? And what are their plans for using these standards that you think will help you build that bridge to where you want to be? Are you wanting to use newer technologies? As much as I love CMI5 and xAPI, I will tell everyone on this discussion to be careful. Adding xAPI for fun to your RFP and saying, I want to do more with data, isn't helpful for the vendors who are trying to respond to it. So be conscious and be focused on what you are trying to do. The end in mind is the most important part of an xAPI implementation. What are you trying to do today that you can't? And is this standard the right way to help? Not, I'm next gen company, I want to use the latest and greatest. It can add a lot of cost and complexity to your situation that you might not otherwise need. SCORM and AICC are still working well if you're just launching a course and needing to see basic data on the other side. Choose the content, or choose the standard rather, that's appropriate for your content. This is the don't go into the technology curve and get the latest and greatest. As much as Brian and I are pushing CMI5, make sure you're using it for the right reasons, make sure you're doing it in the right way, and make sure you're working with vendors that already support it. Asking them for their plans on these things is very important in this moment. The 100 people that are currently in this discussion and the 200 that will watch it later, please go have these conversations, not with Brian and I, we have them all day. You have to go have them with the vendors of the products you love, the content you enjoy, and the platforms you rely on for your reporting. Without that two-way conversation between you and the products that you're using every day, it's very hard for them to realize that, hey, there's a need here that we need to go support right away. Assess what's in your toolbox. Many of the tools you use today might support these things already. It's not the type of thing they can throw a party and send a letter to your house. Hey, we added CMI5. Often it is a small detail that showed up in a feature release that you might not notice you already have. Not as many people get excited about SCORM on a Tuesday as we do, and certainly not CMI5. So talk to your vendors, ask them what their plans are, ask them if they already support it. I think you might be surprised at the tools out there that already do some of these things well today. And it should be on your roadmap. Brian, why don't you talk to us about choosing the right tool in the toolbox for the right job?
Yeah, we covered this to a degree, but this is a really nice way to look at this. And essentially, what we're saying is, what is your end goal, as Chris pointed out. So if you are dealing with an LMS, your learners are accessing, the content through an LMS, and if you're only interested in big four types of data, then SCORM is probably still, the standard for your content. It's going to be the most widely adopted. But as we see kind of you go across the screen, then you start to answer questions of like, okay, I want to have activity types that are more interesting than a slideshow with a quiz at the end. We're talking about mobile apps, serious games, simulations, those types of things. Move us across the spectrum towards something that can capture more and more interesting data like xAPI. Um, very often, as Chris pointed out, your LMS is still going to be present if for no other reason it knows who the learner is and knows who's experiencing this content, and it needs to provide us with some information like where do we capture our xAPI data and how do we authorize that LRS. And that's really where CMI5 comes into play. So it is still the concept of individual learner being launched from a system, whether you call that an LMS or an LXP or whatever. But it allows you to capture more rich data. It allows you to capture those types of interactions that you might see from a CPR dummy or from a VR environment where a user is interacting with the environment. And those are the types of things that we see with in-depth interactions. And then really, if you're going to target something that is multiple people experiencing the same piece of content where that data needs to be captured the same way, or it's data that's not even going through an LMS. It's not planned training. It's not a planned experience. That's really where xAPI starts to shine because you don't have this concept of what we refer to as a session. There's no start. There's no defined start. There's no defined ending. It may be that you're capturing single statements. One of the easiest ways to get started capturing xAPI data is via our bookmarklet, linked on our website. And there's no concept of a session here. It's just you go to a web page and you want to capture that you read that web page. Well, you can bookmarklet it, and that sends xAPI data to an LRS. There's no LMS involved there, and that's really where xAPI starts to shine. So, think about, again, what is your plan? What is the type of data you're capturing, and where is, your learner starting their experience?
Nice. So I think the next thing is, how to future-proof your tech stack. We all want to buy tools that are evergreen. Software changes quickly. Confirm that your vendors have support on their roadmap. Have these conversations about their intentions for doing these things. Are they a part of the standards community? Are they a part of the discussion? Check their migrating off earlier systems and ask their plan for moving to one to another. They want these conversations as vendors. I talk to them all day, and unless this room is asking them for things, they let sleeping dogs lie, as they say here in the States. So having those discussions is the best way to future-proof your tech stack, because this is a larger discussion and it's what you should do next. So Brian, talk to us a little bit about what vendors should be considering.
Yeah, and that's where, talking to the vendors is key, but informing them that they need to be conformant with xAPI 1.0. The adoption on xAPI 2.0 is still very early days. They probably don't even have that on their roadmap yet. So they can start out by being conformant with what has already existed for 10 years, and that's an easier lift. Making sure that they're aware, or having them check out the changes that are in xAPI 2.0. The biggest change here is essentially what used to be shoulds in the requirements. So things that you could do this or you could do something else, a lot of those became hard and fast requirements. But the vendors and those of us in the standards arena have known about these things. They are things that we identified a very long time ago that we should have just made them requirements from the start. So be aware of those. We have a blog post out on xapi.com that'll be linked in the chat for some more specific vendor tips. And then again, if you're using tin can packages, if you're exporting them from an authoring tool and you look inside your zip package and you see tincan.xml, it's time to transition off of that. It's time to talk to your vendor about moving forward with CMI 5.
Awesome. So we've kind of reached the end of our road here, and I want to thank everyone for hanging in there through a seemingly dry conversation that Brian and I love. We're passionate about these problems. We absolutely want to help e-learning products play nicely with one another. There have been some really great questions that have come in during this time, and I'm sad that we're not going to hang out and answer all of them. Two that really stand out to me is, where does the LTI standard fit in this ecosystem? I think that's a fantastic question. One EdTech is the standards body behind the LTI and many other standards, QTI, Common Cartridge. There's a ton of them. They do really great. They fit mostly in K through 20 from what Rustici sees. I'm certainly not an LTI expert, maybe even to the degree that some of the people on this call are. But One EdTech's doing some great work. They've got a list of certified products, platforms, and tools on their site. And I highly recommend checking out imsglobal.org, where they have the certifications and the site for those things. I would say LTI and CMI5 are similar in purpose and implementation. They're different standards for different reasons. I don't want to cause any fiery debate or a war here, but we do admire the LTI standard, the work that One EdTech does. Our platforms support in SCORM Cloud and Rustici Engine and Content Controller LTI 1.3. It's a fantastic standard that we're starting to see increasing in adoption, but not to a degree that's noteworthy in SCORM Cloud at this point. I think there's another question in here that's really interesting, is how does CMI5 xAPI compared to H5P? That's a great one. H5P is more of a standard over the content itself. It is mostly in the Moodle space, K through 20, a little bit of others. It's an interesting one Brian and I look at all the time. It has very little tracking associated with it. It's mostly a content packaging and launch standard that maybe eventually becomes a part of the Rusticy mix. It's certainly the only standard that was asked about in the comments today that we don't fully support right away, but we do hear about it all the time. Um, I want to answer the rest of these questions. Some of them are amazing. Please feel free to reach out to us. Our marketing team has been answering them in the chat and including links where we can. But these are the type of discussions Brian and I love to have all day, every day. So please ask us anything really. If it's technical, you can reach out to support@rusticysoftware.com. If you hop onto rusticysoftware.com, there's an Ask Us Anything button. You can just fill out a form and we will respond right away. This is what we do all day. But thank you all for joining. Thank you for participating in these communities. To my colleagues on the IEEE or with ADL or with One Ed Tech, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your time and we look forward to working with you over the next 5 years.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.